Hey friends, I recently saw an atheist video by a guy calling himself Professor Plink, in which he effectively tore up a Christian YouTuber who was claiming that atheism was irrational. It was fine, but I see no point in repeating the argument. The Christian was an utter fool who came to his conclusions because Pascal's wager. He thought it was irrational to disbelieve in Jesus because if you're right, there is no reward in the afterlife. An argument that assumes the existence of an afterlife, and specifically a Christian afterlife, as its premise. Circular reasoning for the win. Anyway, don't bother with that debate. But I did think that Planck asked an interesting question. What reason could you possibly have to be an atheist? I thought about that question for a bit and thought, why would I need a reason? The underlying assumption is that for a belief to be valid, it must have a rational, logical, evidence-based argument behind it, which is good. I approve of that kind of argument. And that is, of course, a common idea in atheist circles. Also among religious apologists, there are so many Christian and Muslim videos out there that declare their beliefs are good and true, all built on finding a logical syllogism that gives them the answer they want, or fishing some scientific observation out of context and fitting it to their prior beliefs. If the atheist and scientific position on demanding evidence and reason is so wrong, why are the believers so eager to adopt it? And adopt it badly? As I thought about it, though, I grew aware that many atheist arguments are also emotional and irrational. And that's okay. Humans are not emotionless calculating engines, but creatures of squishy psychology and weird personal biases. We don't reason ourselves into an intellectual position. Much of our efforts along those lines are more rationalizations than reasoning from an objective, verifiable premise. And that's true of atheists and believers alike. We all start with an ought that is drawn from our personal subjective experience, and that's fine. A good human philosophy ought to start with our humanity. I have to pity anyone who needs a logical syllogism to justify their experience. This is not to argue that logical contradictions with reality are okay. I'm making an appeal to recognize that the roots of our preferred beliefs are constructed from our human preferences. So, what reasons could I possibly have to be an atheist without using reason? One good explanation is simply chance. I grew up in a household lacking in religious indoctrination and also lacking in atheist indoctrination. My family just didn't care, except in the most superficial way. I simply fell into unbelief, and only later cared enough to try and justify a belief that differed so much from the mainstream. The little religion I was exposed to was primarily performative and token obedience, sufficient to immunize myself against superstition. There are people who reason themselves into atheism, but I wasn't one of them. So it wasn't a triumph of logic that led me here, although I'm quite happy now to have not been trapped in a dogma. Most religious believers are in the same situation. They are Catholic or Lutheran or Baptist because their parents were Catholic or Lutheran or Baptist. There was no reasoning involved. Getting hammered by dogmatic beliefs over and over again as a young child is sufficient to get the child to accept the weird beliefs by default. It's effective at any age. Take a teenager desperate for social acceptance, or a middle-aged person beset with personal trauma, and love bomb them, and you will get a convert. That tactic can also work for atheists, or any wacky, culty belief you can imagine. Humans are irrational and susceptible to emotional situations. I've seen it in atheist communities. I've been to many atheist conferences, and one of the pleasures of these events are all the attendees who are thrilled to find themselves in a group of like-minded people, where you can let your guard down and just enjoy the fellowship. Christians use that word fellowship a lot too, and they know the power of it in reinforcing ideas. I was a lonely atheist for most of my life. Again, my family and friends were secular by default, so it was never a major issue. But I remember the first time I found myself in an atheist meeting sometime back in the 1980s. It was powerful and not in any kind of logical way. These were my people at last. I've experienced the same thing with religious groups, especially when they fire up this strong, passionate music. Not Lee Greenwood garbage. No, that's not inspiring at all. But you can't help but feel uplifted by a good gospel choir or the rhythms of a great preacher. At my university, we have strong Native American connections, and I can assure you a drum circle can be incredibly moving. You can't deny it. We are social animals, and there are a lot of irrational ways that the social connections can be reinforced. Emotional tools can also be used to manipulate people in unhealthy ways. I will be among the first to declare to believers that their followers are often awful people, and that religious leaders are often con artists who are out to abuse their followers using these same group socialization techniques. This has actually become a useful tool for recruiting atheists. The first seed of doubt is planted by seeing the examples of religious apologists. We can see mild examples like the damn fool Christian who made that video promoting Pascal's wager, or by our own family members who voted for Trump because they claim he was a good Christian man. He's not. Or we can see extreme examples like Joel Osteen building a multi-million-dollar fortune with his megachurches, or politicians who foster hate with their religiously motivated legislation against, for instance, gay and trans people. This triggers a justified emotional response, revulsion and disgust against religious belief. This isn't just religious people, though. I feel the same way about some atheists who have tied their intellectual commitment to a hateful support for hypothetical scenarios of bombing Mecca, or have become fanatical patriots promoting America First nonsense and hating immigrants. Disgust is just another powerful emotional driver behind ideologies. Now, wait a minute, you might say. Opposing destructive religious tactics is an entirely rational, logical proposition, and I would agree. Once you've decided that dogmatic beliefs that are contrary to human thriving are bad, it is logical to work against them. But how did you come to that premise in the first place? I would make the radical suggestion that it was a product of indoctrination. We get the ideals of equality and fairness dunned into us from an early age, and it is an extension of human feelings of empathy for our social group. Those are not the product of logic and reason. They're also relatively recent ideas in human cultural development, and we still have a deplorable attitude to kill the outsider in our societies. Religious people recognize our shared values as well. Unfortunately, one of the ways they avoid the feelings of disgust at violations of those values is by crafting rationalizations. Look at Christian defenses of slavery, for instance. We don't want to be slaves. We see it as an undesirable condition, and our natural empathy would lead us to resist it. So there are many people who defend biblical and antebellum slavery by claiming that people were happy, contented, and well cared for in those conditions. Does a post hoc claim that happy slaves existed make it justifiable? No, it does not. We rightfully recognize that we would not want our freedom stolen away, especially not to enrich a slave owner. It's the same story with the subordination of women. It has a long, ugly, and continuing history, but my priors, which emphasize equality and fairness, drive me away from most religions. But there are many people, both atheist and religious, who consider the inequities to be justified. This just tells me that atheism is secondary to healthy social values, and repairing those values should come before we start tearing down the churches. Another value I favor is free inquiry and science. Science is a huge material benefit. And from a pragmatic perspective, we ought to be supporting research. And one prerequisite to science is the free exchange of ideas and the ability to question dogma. Interrogating the religious ideas critically is part of the scientific mindset. So you might suggest that it would be a good idea to be an atheist as part of this scientific enterprise. Or, at least, if you're a believer, to be open-minded and willing to consider that you might be wrong. However, most scientists aren't in the business because they have high-minded ideals about benefiting society by curing diseases or building rocket ships or making better fertilizers. We go into the sciences for less rational reasons. We like asking questions and figuring out ways to answer them. We're keen on poking things and taking them apart and encountering novel phenomena. Yeah, we have to write grant proposals that lay out the good reasons for our work and why it ought to be funded. Okay. But deep down, we're curious monkeys pushing back the foreskin of nature to find out what's underneath for our own personal and sometimes rather weird goals. I study spiders, for instance. Maybe someday there will be some vast societal significance to that, and I believe that simply acquiring knowledge is a virtue. But I can't pretend that's why I'm doing it. I just think spiders are neat. Okay, they're also useful models for answering bigger, more general questions about development and ecology and behavior. The fact that it's a useful endeavor doesn't change the fact that I got into them out of simple curiosity. I have to wrap this up by returning to the point brought up by the original theist, that if you don't believe in an afterlife, there's no point to living. This is a bad argument. Just because something has bad consequences doesn't mean it's not true. Terrible calamities happen all the time, and you can't make them go away by closing your eyes and insisting that they can't happen. My background is in neurodevelopment, and I've delved deep into the structure and function of the nervous system. There's nothing there but cells and fibers and chemicals and electrical activity, and behavior and consciousness are direct products of the physical and chemical properties of the brain. And the brain is incredibly fragile. I've seen directly what happens when an organism dies. In the past, I've done experiments where I insert microelectrodes into single cells in the nervous system of insects. Not people, insects, okay? I've watched how those cells respond over time. I've seen resting potentials gradually decline to zero. I've observed synaptic connections detaching. I've looked on as axons and dendrites break up while the cell is dying, and seen phagocytic cells cruise in and destroy the matrix of the ganglion. With death, the entire framework of the nervous system can decay within minutes and hours. The functional integration of the nervous system can fall apart irrevocably when we die. There will be nothing ourself left, only a disintegrating network of spasming, leaking, blebbing cells that will gradually fall into silence. And that's okay. Denial doesn't change the underlying facts, and there's no point in arguing over the facts. I wish I could say that when the theist dies and his brain turns to soup, he'll find out. But no, sorry, you won't find out anything. He'll be gone. So I have this irrational belief that the finality of death doesn't preclude living a happy life. I also think that's far more logical than believing a man could be dead for a day and a half and then rise up and have a conversation with his friends using his rotting brain. But logic isn't the primary selling point of our beliefs about a hypothetical afterlife. It should be a focus on the reality of our existence right now. And no matter how bad our situation gets, it's still better than being dead. So I strive to be a good little atheist, living in the moment, and fighting to stay alive and improve the world for myself and everyone else. Ultimately, I haven't logicked myself into that position. I haven't developed a syllogism to prove that my way is the only way. I just follow my feelings, and it works. You should do that too.